Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, all my dear viewers. This is the grand return of Applied Virtues interviews. My name is William, and today with me here is Classical Theist. Do you mind if I call you CT?
Yeah, absolutely. Good to be
All
with you.
right. So, for those of you who are just tuning in, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, so good to be with you. I was able to peruse your YouTube content a bit, and gotta say, it's a lot of great stuff, a lot of really good stuff. And I pretty much started this started this thing, probably back in 2017 or so, just because back then I felt like there wasn't really a there wasn't really a lot of popular content online that was trying to uh, sort of bridge the gap between, uh, you know, apologetically speaking, bridge the gap between uh, classical theism and Christianity. So that was kind of my initial mission was to make videos and to uh, throughout the course of online content creation, Twitter, whatever, is try to make more and more and more accessible uh, what I see as the uh, logical progression from this more rarefied and abstract classical theist conception of God and the fundamental truths of Christianity, such as the incarnation, plausibility of the incarnation, the mystical body. So that was kind of my initial uh, goal, so to speak, for creating the channel. Then it kind of just snowballed into uh, me just trying to help others understand the faith at a bit more fundamental uh, levels, uh, using primarily the metaphysical thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And really, that's kind of just been what I've been doing since I started the channel. So I've been thankfully a decent number of people have been receptive to it.
Well, I'm glad that you've been having such a good time. I had a good time with this. Perused your content, and I have to say, I've been following you since the beginning. You have a great channel. You do great work. Um, Recently, I watched some of your cozy TV replays, and I
Yeah,
and
yeah, it's a new thing I've been doing. Yeah.
yeah, I really like them. I really like the guy you have on.
Well, thanks.
Um,
I appreciate it. I've never done streaming before that. I've never done live streaming before that. I've always just done these like pre-recorded, mostly scripted videos. So I was kind of apprehensive about how the streams would be receptive because that's something that has kind of been foreign to my skill set. So hopefully, as the time goes by, I'll be able to cultivate that a bit more. But I'm glad you've been enjoying them.
yeah. I just most of my channel is live stream content, so I do know a thing or two about that. Uh, it's, I mean, it's very good when you have a general idea of what you want to cover, even if
Yeah.
you are like if you're reacting like point by point to a video that you've never seen, you're not going to and you're just like pausing every 5 seconds to say something that can get a little annoying. But when you
Right.
have, but when even if you're reacting, because even if you're going to be live reacting to something, I think it's good to know what you want, or know what the other person has said and what you want to say in response to them, so that you don't come across as like a bot that just takes every little thing, reacts to every little thing, and doesn't
Yeah.
consider the whole of the other piece.
I think it's always a good idea to plan out what you're going to say ahead of time. So I spend a lot of time writing notes and outline and stuff. So
Mm. Yeah, I sometimes do that too. Um, this is actually one of the few interviews um, that I have not written notes. I instead have like all this research material, like books and articles, out with me that
Yeah,
we might go over. But if you want really a good explanation of integralism, um, perhaps the best summary of integralism has is found on the Hosea's website. Would
yeah,
you agree
that's
with
a good.
that?
I think that's a great website. I also, for someone who just wants a book, I cannot recommend any more strongly, and I'm sure you probably know what I'm going to say. Father Crean and Alan Phimister's Manual of Political Philosophy, titled Integralism. I think that is, for those of you who really want to understand it uh, in its essence, who want to understand it in terms of its essential principles. Uh, get this book because it's it's cited cover to cover with all sorts of magisterial sources, with sources from the Church Fathers, from the Scholastics. Um, it's also, I think, historically literate as well, and it's also metaphysically grounded too. So it's one of those rare instances where you really come across a treatment of integralism that is thoroughly grounded in the Catholic intellectual tradition, and very carefully and precisely worded to further that to further that end. So I strongly recommend that book. I was just reading it today to kind of brush up for this as well. So like
Yeah,
I
this is a great book. It's very thick. It's the kind of book that I really like to read because it's very thick with nice footnotes. Some of the footnotes get a little long, but that's okay.
Yeah,
It's
and
it
look, if you're too lazy to read all of it, he has done us the wonderful favor of at the end of each chapter listing all of the theses of the chapter in
Yeah,
like
that is
propositional
amazing.
format. So it's like,
Yeah, yeah. Theses, like for example, on for chapter 8, theses 1, differences in the subject of temporal power give rise to three pure kinds of politics, each of which is legitimate and each of which admits of many species of constitution. And then it goes on from there. In pure monarchy, the sovereign alone enjoys temporal power. In
it's
pure
kind of like a
aristocracy, blah 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 blah.
yeah, it's kind of like a textbook in the best way possible, in the best sense of the word. It's really, I think, it seems to be designed to help you study this stuff, and I just recommend it very highly.
All right. So integralism in the if you want to boil it down, the this website called the Hosea's um, boils it down in just three sentences. Catholic integralism is a tradition of thought that, rejecting the liberal separation of politics from concern with the end of human life, holds that the political order must order man to his final goal. Since, however, man has both a temporal and an eternal end, integralism holds that there are two powers that rule him, a temporal power and a spiritual power. And since man's temporal end is subordinated to his eternal end, the temporal power must be subordinated to the spiritual power. So that might sound a bit wordy, but for just a three sentence summary, but each of those sentences is packed with a lot of intellectual heft to it, and that's part of the reason why I like um, doing this kind of Catholic philosophy, philosophizing, because this is a tradition that is very hefty. Um,
I mean, I'll say one thing that when you're reading Catholic philosophy and you're writing Catholic philosophy, um, the rule about avoiding run-on sentences just goes out the window. Uh, that's what I found. You know, uh,
I mean, I try to limit my sentence length to
yeah.
a reasonable size, but yeah, I do notice that um, that kind of vice in manualists
Yeah, but I
sometimes.
think that with integralism, we should kind of focus on the word itself just a little bit because
Hmm.
when we say that things are um, integral, or when we speak of an integral unity, we're really talking about things being uh, perhaps distinct in themselves, yet ordered a toward the good of the unified whole. So, with respect to integralism, what we're talking about is two uh, levels, two dimensions of the human being: uh, the natural, the supernatural, the temporal, the spiritual. And what integralism wants to insist upon, and I think it's just grounded in a sensible metaphysical picture of reality, is that um, you know, within the human person himself, the supernatural and the natural are not severed. In fact, there's a proper order between them. The natural is for the sake of this of the supernatural, because the natural has within itself that obediential potency to be elevated to partake of the supernatural life of God, and this is part of man's own essential constitution. And what integralism is going to say is that, well, man himself is composed this way, so it really doesn't make sense to sever those two things uh, in civil society either, because the civil society is an extension of human nature. Man is a social animal just as much as he is a rational animal. His social nature stems from his rationality, of course, um, and because of that, the proper ordering of the natural dimension of the human person and and his capacity to be elevated into a supernatural state of life, ultimately partaking of the divine nature itself. Um, this is an those two dimensions are integrally united in the human person, so they should also be integrally united in in the wider society itself. Uh, it just wouldn't make sense in the abstract to uh, sever one from the other. Uh, you could even relate it mystically if you want to the Lord's Prayer, on earth as it is in heaven, right? Um, God created the world. God created uh, not only the human being but the entire cosmos in order um, to participate in according to the order that He imbued in the universe according to His wisdom, to participate in the eternal law. And the eternal law is uh, God's the ordering of the cosmos that God has in his mind according to his wisdom, uh, manifested in the created order. And what he wants, logically, is for the entire universe of beings to uh, participate in the eternal law according to the dictates of their own nature. So that's essentially what natural law is. Natural law is the rational creature's participation in the eternal law, and it's 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 in the measure that we participate in the eternal law that we uh, that we uh, conform to the order that God had intended to imbue in the created cosmos. So um, integralism is kind of just saying we should structure society in such a way that intends to keep all of this intact. And maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I think that's just some important preliminary concepts that we can lay out here when we're discussing what integralism is about. It really, I think, stems from a very simple idea.
I would say that yes. One thing uh, that we were talking about before this live stream started is that the um, integralism is basically a natural extension of just applying Christian morality consistently. We right we
Yeah.
wouldn't just because Christianity is more than just the natural law. Don't get me wrong. As a Thomist, I believe that natural law plays an indispensable part of Scripture and sacred tradition and the Church and so on, and that Christian life can't be Christian without the natural law. But by the same token, there's more to revelation than simply what can be discovered through natural reason. And so the idea of integralism is that, well, look, if you're a Christian, you wouldn't compartmentalize your Christianity and separate it off from, say, how you do business or how
Right.
you how how you judge court cases as a judge, or even how you work in the military, or even and especially not in like the privacy of your home. So if you are an integralist, if you are integrating Christian morality to all of these separate spheres, then why wouldn't you integrate a specifically Christian morality in the sphere of politics? To making laws on the basis of what God has revealed to us. Because if you understand that the supernatural end that the church teaches that we have is a real phenomenon, then it's not something that can be compartmentalized as if the church is just over here, and then we have politics. It's not something that isn't something that should be part compartmentalized in any case. In We wouldn't compartmentalize it in other cases, so why would we do it here? And I think,
Yeah, and I also think it. Oh, yeah,
mm,
go ahead.
yeah, and I think that people who are scared of integralism, or the you have these people who worry about theocracy or Christian nationalism or whatnot. A lot of these people, they seem to want to compartmentalize Christ's teachings so that God doesn't God's role, Jesus's role in politics, is, if it doesn't, if it isn't entirely absent, it takes sort of a back seat.
Yeah. There are a couple of things I want to say about this. For
Hmm.
one, it's impossible, metaphysically impossible, to compartmentalize it in this way. I mean, think about just the fact that Christ's dominion over us doesn't just stop at doesn't stop at the edge of our uh, immortal souls. It stretches over the entirety of all creation. Every rock, every tree that you encounter is under the dominion of Christ, ultimately, because He's the Logos of all creation. So, uh, in a certain sense, the trees and the sticks and the stones inhabit an integralist universe, because the same divinity that imbues its and imbues the act of existence to all created things is the same divinity that became incarnate in Jesus Christ and instituted the church as His own mystical body. Uh, it's the same Lord. It's the same divine reality that is present in and through all things. And so uh, the uh, are you still there? Uh, Okay, not sure if he's still here, but I guess I'll keep going. Yeah, the simple fact is you cannot escape uh the divine providence over all things. And because of that, it doesn't make any sense to carve out some exception to this rule, as if human society could be the one exception uh, where the providence of God and the lordship of God ought not have full dominion. The providence of God has dominion over all things that exist. It has dominion over the way in which trees develop, has dominion over which the way in which uh, animal life develops, has dominion over all things, and it
And
also therefore has dominion over the over human beings and human society. So that's one thing I would say about it. Another thing I would say about it is that um, what integralism does is it fulfills, I think, uh, a a necessity that would otherwise be uh, unfulfilled, and that has to do with the very nature of society itself. And you read this in the integralism book, where he talks about the very nature of what society is, and how in order to understand what society is, you have to break it up into two um, distinct kinds of society: the perfect society and the imperfect society. Um, and essentially, what a society is would be, um, multiple members of uh, of the human race making up for our individual limitations and deficiencies in order to bring about uh, the social conditions that make the attainment of uh, human happiness or human fulfillment possible. We can't attain to human fulfillment on our own individually, and that's just evident from the fact that the human person, uh, each individual human person varies in talent and skill and capacity. Um, and so human beings have to come together in order to bring about the conditions necessary for attaining human fulfillment. Um, the problem is, though, we recognize through metaphysical and philosophical investigation that the human person has within himself this capacity for the infinite, and this capacity for the infinite will necessarily make him uh, insatiable by uh, or rather, it will make him unable to be satiated by any temporal or finite good. And so, therefore, uh, any society that's created by man necessarily cannot fulfill uh, the very end for which a human society exists at all, namely to bring about the condition for the realization of human fulfillment. And so, this must terminate in the existence of a perfect society. What is a perfect society? A perfect society is one in which it does have all the essential components to bring about human fulfillment. And I think you have to recognize that precisely because human beings on our own cannot create this condition, um, this perfect society has to be established by God Himself. Uh, and more to it, what you see in Christianity in particular is that the inability for humanity for human beings to bring about their own fulfillment or to satiate uh, their own hunger for the infinite, that in the divine mind is uh, satiated by way of the incarnation, and the incarnation is able to finally bridge that gap. Uh, but it's not just the incarnation by itself, because then you have to ask the question, well, how do we fit into the equation? Well, we fit into the equation by way of the incarnation uh, being uh, opening itself up to our participation in it, and this is what we call the mystical body, the church. The church is that perfect society. The church is that societas perfecta, that that organism, that organizational principle that enables us to actually participate in the uh, the only way in which the human being can truly be fulfilled, which again, as I said, is the end for which all human societies exist in the first place. So, if human societies, purely human societies, are imperfect and do not have that capacity to bring about human fulfillment or to create the conditions necessary for human fulfillment, then they have to give way to the perfect society that can do this, and that is the church. So you have to have this proper due subordination between the imperfect societies to the perfect society. There can only be one perfect society because there can only be one God, and uh, one there's only one Christ, and that one Christ has one mystical body. Uh, and so, uh, just on these more philosophical and metaphysical and theological grounds, I think we have to be committed to the notion that any human society that exists has to ultimately yield to the perfect society in order to justify the purpose of its own existence.
Right. I think also um, the book in question makes a very good point about politics being if politics this is from the first chapter. If politics is the study of the highest good, proportionate to human nature, which may be obtained on Earth. Um, so, you can't just exclude the you can't just exclude the church from any consideration. You can't exclude religion from that because um, the re- because it is a real end that you must it is a real end that
Right.
must be taken into account. And you can't really just. I mean, it's fine if I get it's understandable if you are ignorant of uh, of man's final end, and thus, or maybe you're mistaken about man's final end. But to positively exclude as a category any notion of a supernatural final end is itself just a subjective, arbitrary consideration, which is one of the things I pointed out in my secularism video. That, when secularists try to define religion, they simply are eh, they don't really have any principle by which to distinguish the religious ideas from the non-religious ideas in an objective way. So it always
Right.
ends up being, they always end up arbitrarily declaring that certain ideas are just off limits and certain ideas are not off limits. So the notion of human rights, even though that has its origins as a theological concept, that is somehow okay, but God forbid you you make the you make say the recognition of Jesus Christ as the Son of
Yeah.
God something that something that of public importance.
Well, what people don't realize is that this whole talk of rights or religious toleration or or even to some extent separation of church and state, its origin it has its origin in uh, a a solution that was thoroughly pragmatic. I mean, if you want to go back to the Treaty of Westphalia or something like that, the purpose was just to carve out um, a temporal state of affairs that would prevent religious violence. It wasn't born out of some some deeply fundamental like metaphysical commitment to uh, liberty for its own sake. And what you realize in tracing the pedigree back to that is the utter lack of a firm basis that uh, liberalism really has. It really never stopped to actually justify its own premises. It was born out of this, like I said, this pragmatic concern about preventing religious violence, but uh, in taking on a life of its own, uh, detached from those pragmatic considerations, it really isn't able to justify itself on any kind of firm uh, metaphysical basis. Like you and I, for example, like if we were in like a Catholic state or something, and let's say there's some Protestant revolt, and then there's endless fighting and what have you, then the prudent man can say, okay, let's put a pause on our confessional state for the sake of for the sake of peace, right? Um, that is not coming at the uh, that is not in order to do that, we don't have to sacrifice our metaphysical commitments. We're basically saying that, okay, we have these metaphysical commitments, we have these theological commitments, and we do ultimately want an integralist state, but for the purpose of securing safety and peace and security, we're gonna put a little bit of put a little bit of a halt on that, so that we can kind of regroup and rework this arrangement, so to speak. But liberalism doesn't it doesn't really have any of those. Uh, it doesn't really have a root in the nature of things. We do. Uh, Everything that we've been talking about is thoroughly grounded in a metaphysically thought out picture of the world. And it's once we've done that, then we can say, okay, now how do we actually apply this stuff? How does the prudent man
Mm.
work out the best possible application of these principles? Um, so like for example, like we might a liberal and myself, we may very well, if the circumstances require it, end up in a similar kind of political situation on the ground, uh, if the circumstances require it. But I have a reason for it. He does not.
Well, I would like to say that although it does, yeah, the threat of religious violence or religious persecution is something that a lot of these people bring up. A lot of critics of integralism often, they use this rhetoric of, oh well, without liberalism, we would have the inquisitors going around murdering Protestants
Right.
willy nilly. That's it. That's it. That is what um, they argue,
Yeah.
and they and so you have the and so you have these integralists who they're just pointing out this stuff, and the response of the liberal is to go from political liberalism into theological liberalism,
Right.
and that's actually kind of
With no
different.
basis.
Well, what they try to do is say that reason is supreme in politics. You can't,
Hmm.
and faith is because faith is subjective. There's nothing. There's no. If you look at John Locke, he was actually a theological minimalist,
Hmm.
and that was the basis of his views on toleration. It's this idea that there is no principled way to discern what is the true, which Christian denomination is right about these issues. So the only a solution is just to say that they're all right, or at least have the state be like this neutral playing ground for these groups, except for Catholics. Catholics are not allowed,
Right,
which
because
is
we're the which kind of makes sense if you think about it, because we are the moral and we are the uh, morally imperialistic ones. Um,
as if
although
I mean, John Locke was not. Yeah, John Locke was not like an anti-moralist. He was very much clear. I mean, his entire view of natural law is based on God's ownership of us and what He
right, well, I
wants.
guess what I mean by that is we are the ones that I shouldn't simply say moral imperialism, but we also, uh, if you want to say, ecclesiological imperialism,
Well,
if you will. Like
well, I
we,
guess
we
I
yeah,
guess I mean the reason John Locke excluded Catholics is because they see that uh, Locke thinks of churches as voluntary societies, and the Catholic conception is so radically against that that he under his definitions, the church is a rival state, and with the Pope being a rival prince to the King of England.
right,
So he would say that these are excluded on the grounds that they would create a society in which you have citizens who owe their allegiance to two princes, and so if the if the country of England ever comes into conflict with the Pope, then these Catholics are like um, what's the word? They'll undermine.
yeah, they have dual loyalty, and
Yeah, they have dual loyalty.
they
Exactly.
have to
That's the exact.
prioritize. Yeah,
They have those dual loyalties, and so they'll undermine the security of the state. And that's
which
his.
isn't. I mean, which is kind of it's. You could say it's partly true, but it's also partly not true. I mean, as Catholics, we don't have necessarily temporal loyalty to Vatican State, to the Vatican City State. Like our we have to have our due submission to the Pope, and we have to recognize that the Pope uh, ought to ultimately wield the two swords. But um, that doesn't necessarily translate to um, like a dual loyalty that would make Catholics necessarily like subversive agents of uh, of a foreign state.
Yeah, and I think that that kind of view of things is also what we see in a lot of integralist papers, which is why there is a certain Catholic author who often compares integralists to Islamic terrorists.
All right, yeah,
Uh, and I'm speaking of John Zmirak. In case you don't know, he's this conservative. Um, he is this conservative author who he's written a lot of books, some of the which I have, but he on the question of integralism, he's very much a liberal, and he actually justifies it on the grounds that um, because it's something because knowledge of Catholicism comes from faith and not reason, we shouldn't impose it onto to the state, and we shouldn't impose it onto the state if we are living in a society where there are Catholics and non-Catholics.
hmm
And he would say this even if there were 99 Catholics and one non-Catholic, he wouldn't want he would not want his position seems to entail that you can't
right.
impose Catholicism onto that person,
Which
which
is, of
is
course, just contrary to what the popes have taught. I mean, like, if you look at Leo the 13th in Immortale
yeah,
Dei, he's very clear that, you know, uh, there can and should be this uh, soul body marriage between a state and the church. That is
yeah,
desirable. Now, granted, it may not be able to prudently happen in many cases, like today, at least not right now. But to say that it shouldn't be desirable, I think I think it not only undermines papal teaching, it undermines our own our entire eschatology, right? I mean, like uh, what are we really looking for if not the ultimate subjection of all things
hmm,
under Christ? I mean, the Psalms, for example, are also just very uh, that they always tend to invoke this desire for all nations to be subject to the Lord, right? Um, it's
Hmm.
It's all throughout the Psalms. It's all throughout Scripture. This notion that Christ should have
Hmm.
dominion over all nations.
Yeah, it's
And what does that mean if not ultimately Catholic nations, right? I mean, unless you're going to be a indifferentist, um, like a theological indifferentist. I mean, you have to believe that, okay, the fullness of, as Lumen Gentium says, the Church of the Church of Christ exists entirely as the Catholic Church, subsists in the Catholic Church. That's what the word mean, uh, broken down into multiple words. So the Catholic Church is it, and we have to be very clear about what our desirable ends are. Now we can talk about the means all day, like obviously it would be like if we had you know let's say like Lenny from the young Pope becomes Pope tomorrow, and he's this overzealous trad, and he wants to take over the entire world, and he wants all nations to be Catholic. It would obviously be very, very, very imprudent for him to like send in uh you know papal troops into various countries to try. Of course, he would be woefully unsuccessful, but I mean, let's just say like
yeah,
he
that
had
would
or
be yeah, that
that
would
would be ridiculous. That would be absurd. And that's not what we're trying. Well, we're not saying like an integralist state at all costs, and we're gonna like militantly fight for this in the streets. No, 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 no. That's uh, w- at least you and I would are totally committed to the notion that evangelization has to happen first. You have to win the hearts of uh, most people first in order to sow the seeds so that the ground can be uh, so the soil can be rich enough to be receptive to uh, the the integral union of the church and the state. But that's the desirable end, and I just feel like so many people don't even believe in that as a desirable end, and that's just insane to me.
mm, well, I
And if
mean,
we could
this
all
is
be
the
on the same page on that desirable end, I don't think we'd have it. Like, I don't think there would be a need to like uh, have these video discussions defending integralism. We'd all be on the same page. We'd just be arguing logistics at that point. But we just can't get these
yeah,
people to square one.
yeah, the idea in what we see in John Zmirak here is that the I mean he argues that uh, he argues first and foremost that the modern state isn't liberal because it's not something that Richard Hooker or John Locke would have agreed with.
Hmm.
Um, it's he uh, so he wants he and so the evil leftist hijacked the word. So there's not, and never mind what previous Catholic authors have said that I think there was one pope who said that the liberalism is the father of Bolshevism.
Hmm.
In that if you take liberal conclusions like the supremacy of reason, which is what which is what John Zmirak believes, and this, he believes that when it comes to specifically the laws of the state, that only what truths can be obtained through natural reason should have any bearing whatsoever, and
And
that
see, this is a problem because, like, okay, if you're gonna believe that, okay, but those are not Catholic principles. Like, if you're going to believe that, then okay, you might as well just be like maybe a Christian deist or a Protestant. But those are just foundationally not Catholic principles. As Catholics, we believe that that natural reason and supernatural revelation go together as one integral unity. Uh, we believe that they're really distinct, and so I think this is the key to Catholic anthropology and Catholic political theology, which is that the natural and the supernatural are really distinct, so that we don't believe in theocracy. We don't believe in clerics running secular offices. Um,
mm,
of course, we do believe that the Pope is ultimately a, a holder of both swords, but in terms of like ordinary rulers of nations, we don't believe that those should be occupied by clerics. We don't believe in theocracy. What we do believe in, though, is a proper ordering of the one realm to the higher realm. And we
Mm.
believe that those are really distinct. So we believe nature and grace are really distinct. We believe that the soul and the body are really distinct. We believe that um, we believe that the uh, church and the state ought to be really distinct. But a real distinction uh, doesn't imply a wall of separation. It implies a proper order, proper ordering of the imperfect to the perfect. And this is why we believe that nature is perfected by grace. So reason is perfected by revelation. Reason in and of itself is imperfect, and it ultimately yearns for its fulfillment and completion in the supra-rational,
Yeah,
in divine revelation, to know the intimate life of God, and these the, to believe in the integral union of these these various dualities of natural and supernatural realities, or between these two natural and supernatural realities, I should say. That's essential to Catholic thought, to papal teaching, to magisterial teaching. It is essentially, I think, it lies at the heart and foundation of Catholic ecclesiology, of Catholic anthropology. There, I would say that one of the hallmarks of Catholicism is our uh, is how we categorize uh, nature and grace. That they are uh, really distinct, but yet uh, ordered as the imperfect is to the perfect. And this
yeah.
is this
I
is
think,
something that if you're not on board with, I just don't see why you're in this religion.
well, I mean, his argument is that Vatican II rules. His first argument is that divine revelation shouldn't guide us in. The natural law is the only proper basis for legislation, and divine revelation shouldn't guide us because not everybody has access to it, and it's not something that it's a gift we receive from God, and so these truths can only be obtained in the quiet of our conscience, and it's not something that can be forced onto people, which is what he claims that integralists want. They want to enforce Christian
Hmm.
morality onto non-Christians, Catholic morality onto
Ah, yeah. See,
Protestants. On
that's
the,
a straw
on the
man too, because we don't believe that the church has direct jurisdiction over the non-baptized. Uh, we
well, I
believe.
mean, well, he would say that the church, he would say that. I mean, he's arguing against. He thinks he boils down. I mean, he actually says one part here that the only difference between like a Reaganite conservative and a true integralist is that it is that integralists want to persecute Protestants.
Hmm.
Like that is what his position is. Um, he doesn't really. So he doesn't really have he doesn't really have any kind of of like basis other than I don't want my Protestant friends to be put into jail. And this is unjust, and it's clearly against Vatican II. That's another thing. He would say that if you believe that Vatican II did not prohibit integralism, then you are basically practicing Catholic taqiyya. Uh, he constantly
Hmm.
uses the
Yeah,
Islamic.
I remember him using those words. Yeah.
Yeah, he
Um.
constantly uses the Islamic stuff. in order to, he always is playing on the anti-Islamic prejudice that's
Yeah.
very common against amongst like American conservatives.
I mean, did
And
you want to address Vatican II? Like, I think it could maybe be like the last thing we address because I think that's
oh yeah,
important
that's a
actually.
yeah
Like
that's
with Dignitatis Humanae and everything.
yeah. So what do you what do you think? Is it? I mean, so when we look at John Zmirak, who's been our sort of uh, foil
Yeah.
during this stream, he argues that the church up until 400 AD practiced precisely what he taught. He thinks is the correct church teaching, which is like religious freedom for all groups, basically, as long as they follow
That, that,
natural law.
that's so funny. Wait, did you say up until 400 AD?
Yeah, up until according to
So you mean
him,
when the church had absolutely no institutional power and was being
yes,
persecuted and had no
yes,
ability whatsoever to
yes, yeah, and
Okay.
so up until that, they practiced what he's teaching, and
Gee,
then
it's like I wonder why they didn't wield any power. Oh, maybe because they didn't have any.
well, and then he argues that there is zero evidence, zero that any of the apostles or any church father before Constantine argued for the church to use force against Christian dissenters. It's not a part of, and when later churchmen they had to appeal to the Old Testament in order to do that, and that's somehow to justify that, and that's somehow illegitimate, apparently, because you can't appeal to the Old Testament to argue for Christianity. Uh, okay, well, this Pope's and so it says here, when we see papal or council documents defending the right to persecute, they are not passing divine revelation. They are making natural law arguments. They are saying that reason tells us the true religion should prevail in its purest form. This serves the common good. So the state should serve the common good by suppressing errors and silencing heretics. But there's one problem. Natural law alone cannot show you which religion is true. That requires the free gift of grace. And so um, all the proclamations of the popes prior to Vatican II on this issue were non-infallible. And if you think that they were infallible, then you have to also accept the errors of Pope Francis.
Well, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, let's just address that really quickly. We can put that to bed immediately. Uh, Quanta Cura uses language that fulfills all the criteria of Vatican I for papal infallibility. I mean, and that is a document that very explicitly uh, teaches, integralist principles. Okay, so let's just recognize that. Number two, nowhere in
John Zmirak is actually a conciliarist of the heresy. I have read his book on Catholicism.
does he
He
actually
does
believe?
te- he believes in conciliarism.
So he's
According,
not Catholic then, right? I mean,
he
I
calls
mean, I
himself
mean, I mean,
Catholic.
I just have to like, does he reject Vatican One? Because I mean, the Vatican One is like
I
the
mean, he interprets it in a conciliarist way. Like he doesn't.
well,
He he argues in his book on Catholicism that the Pope has only made six, only he's only made two infallible
yeah.
decrees in the history,
When
2,000 year history.
somebody says that, I just tune out because like that is just. I think that that requires such a level of I think of of uh, of reaching that I just can't abide. Like it's it's evidence of someone who just is not able to read something and apply what they read to particular circumstances. And in the
Oh,
easiest of ways, like uh, we don't have to go through like all of the other various ex-cathedra statements that I think apply. But I mean, to say that it's first of all to say that it's reducible to two in like the 19th and 20th century, that in my opinion just defeats the entire purpose of the
Papacy.
The gift of infallibility, because if Christ conferred onto Peter this gift of infallibility and it's not going to be used until like 2000 years later and only twice, that how is it in any way like the guarantor of orthodoxy or the guarantor of the deposit of faith? The, anyway, that's just kind of ridiculous to me. I didn't realize John Zmirak was this far gone about these issues.
Oh yeah, he is. The worst part is that he's in favor of Christian nationalism.
Okay,
So he's not even consistent with himself on these issues.
so what does that mean?
Well,
What
he just
is
doesn't. Well, I mean, his yeah, I mean, his gripe is that
like
he
the idea that
doesn't
we're
want.
all just going to be kind of Christians and just like
Well,
kind
I
of
mean,
live together
yeah,
without any kind of
without
structure
yeah.
or okay.
Well, I mean, it's. I mean, he has this kind of liberal view of Vatican II, which preached that it preached religious liberty and was
Yeah,
against integralism.
let's talk about that really quickly because I think this is well, it's not easily. I don't think you can easily settle the issue because it is difficult. I mean, I have to acknowledge that the difficulty of it, the difficulties that come from dealing with that document.
Hmm.
Um, I think it is worded in a very unfortunately vague and unhelpful way. But that being said, um, I think we have to read Dignitatis Humanae within a Leonine context, and this is what Thomas Pink tries to do, and I think he
Mm.
does it rather successfully. Um, which is to say that what Dignitatis Humanae is ultimately talking about, because it does explicitly affirm that it intends to keep intact the traditional teachings of the church. Well, what are the traditional teachings of the church on church and
Yeah,
state?
we don't
Those
really.
have
I mean,
been
we don't really see that in John Smirek's writings. That line.
right. Yeah, and it's in there, and everybody knows what that refers to. They weren't babies, they weren't dummies. Like they understood what that line referred to. It referred to the the Leonine corpus, the corpus of Pius the ninth. It 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 was it's in reference to Mirari Vos. Uh, these 19th century documents of the church. Um, and what I think Dignitatis Humanae is ultimately trying to get at is to speak of the relationship of the church to states that are fundamentally disinterested in being confessional states. So when we're dealing with that situation, yeah, the church does have to interact with the state very differently because what it's really doing is it's giving us I think a richer uh, notion of what rights belong to the state and what rights actually belong to the church. The state does not have the authority to coerce in religious matters in and of itself because it's a natural body. How could it? How could a natural temporal body, an imperfect society, have the right to coerce in matters that are ultimately belonging to the supernatural order of things? Um, it does not have that right. However, what the and so because of that, uh, if we're considering the state as detached from this soul body union of state and church, then of course the state would kind of have to be relatively neutral in matters of uh, religion for the purpose of protecting the church ultimately. That's what people don't get. I think we have to look at Dignitatis Humanae from the motivation of protecting the church and her rights. I mean, what did Vatican II succeed? It succeeded the early 20th century, totalitarianism that did in many ways try to suppress the church, and
Hmm.
uh, and the church has her own rights to be protected from the tyranny of the state. And so what the church is saying is that the state doesn't have these rights, but in order to keep intact the traditional teachings of the church, we also must affirm that the church has these rights. And if there
So,
is a situation in which the church and the state come
mm,
together in this soul body union, then the state or then the church can 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 Christify society through the state as an organ,
Hmm.
as an instrument,
Yeah. So
and that's how to
what?
reconcile it.
Hmm. So I have only two more questions, and then we'll
Yeah,
wrap things up.
sure.
So, I mean, John Zmirak does talk about Thomas Pink in his thing, but he just
Mm,
says that
okay.
it's wrong. He's wrong, clearly wrong, because the popes affirm John Zmirak's interpretation of Vatican II. He just kind of asserts this, and he gives the example of Pope John Paul II apologizing on behalf of the church for the abuses of fellow Christians' religious freedoms. Um, you know, and he says that this shows this shows that integralism can't possibly be true. Either integralism is false, or the past five popes have teaching on this interpretation of Vatican II has been false,
Yeah.
and then that would make Catholics into like liars. Basically, there would be no dissenters of
Well,
good standing on that issue.
there's a couple things I'll say about that. First of all, even the new Code of Canon Law, the 1983 Code of Canon Law, does say in it that the church has coercive authority over the baptized. So this
Hmm.
integralist principle is still upheld by the current church law. Secondly, I can concede that John Paul II was probably in his own mind not thoroughly, a Leonine in how he construed church and state relations. But I don't think that really made it. I don't think that made its way into his official magisterium for one. Uh, if it did, again, I insist and I maintain that uh, integralist principles have been codified in the ex cathedra body of papal teaching in the person of Pius IX, and because of that, if there's any like low level papal teaching that goes against that, we just gotta reject that in favor of what's definitively taught. Um, and in addition to that, I also just think that you know, John Paul II, uh, he may well have been in his own private mind a little bit more liberalized in how he conceived of how the church and the state ought to relate to each other. But
Mm.
um, the I don't see how you could use that as a way of um, discounting the integralist project as such, considering the fact that it just has so much magisterial weight behind it in its own right across centuries. I mean, uh, so I think it's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's the thing is that it's you know I mean, he's just so this kind of you would say that this kind of dilemma between making all of these churchmen liars or deluded, either making all these churchmen who are talking about religious freedom, they're saying it, that's that either they're all lying and it's is kind of a Catholic tequila or Jesuitical trickery, or it's or the the integralists are false. And your
Yeah,
answer to that would be your answer to that would be, John is just not paying attention to what is in fact infallible papal teaching.
yeah, I think that's partially my answer. And I would also say that, I think that uh, for the most part, when the popes today are wanting to support religious liberty, John Paul II, despite his global apology tour, which I admit was pretty embarrassing, um, nevertheless, I think that his primary prerogative, or not prerogative, his primary intention in supporting religious liberty is fundamentally from the standpoint of protecting the church and protecting the interests of the church from hostile secular states. 'Cause we have to remember that uh, we have to keep in mind that um, the state today, the states today, are extraordinarily hostile to the Christian faith and to the church. And so it makes sense for us currently at least to try to disarm the states of their meddling in religious affairs for our own protection. That's a sensible disposition to have in this current era. However, I just think that if we're really going to be grounded in Catholic tradition, while we may exhibit that disposition currently, it ultimately has to be in the service of one day hoping for
Hmm.
the subordination of those states that are hostile now to one day be uh, reunited in friendship with Christ and the Church.
Hmm. All right. So right now we've been covering a lot of reasons why opponents of integralism do not like it. But I want to cover another reason besides the many that you've given why I personally find it to be a rather um, pertinent doctrine. Um,
Hmm.
so integralism. So when we think of the 20th century, we think of totalitarian ideologies.
Yeah.
Now, people tend to say, "Oh, totalitarianism is this and that and whatnot," but they don't ever really say what is totalitarianism. They just label it. You have people who are really sloppy in how they label things totalitarian. Like there are people who say, I remember this one liberal guy named Razorfist who on Twitter claimed that
Oh, Razor Fist, bruh.
monarchies are totalitarian. Uh,
Yeah. Well, that guy's just a complete fool. But yeah.
yeah, it's you have these people, but when you dig down and look at what totalitarianism is, it's essentially the view that the state is the sole arbiter of authority, that all authorities are subsumed by the state.
Yeah, and that the state is the end of the society. Like the good
Hmm.
of the state is the end of the society. And
Yes,
that's
and
not what we believe.
well, no, and but more to the point,
Yeah.
if you want to avoid totalitarianism,
Ah.
the only way you can do that is to have some authority that is higher than the state, that the state
Ah,
answers
yes,
to.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now you can always say that. Now a Christian like John Zmira can always say that God is the ultimate authority, and the states derive their authority from God. But in his view, the church is subordinate to the state effectively, as in the state is the one that decides what happens, and there's not really, and the church is just a voluntary body of individuals united by their belief in Jesus that they can't rationally prove at all.
Right.
In his words, he actually says that nope, you can't rationally prove that Christianity is true.
That's against Vatican One.
Yeah, that's I mean, I mean, he's taught. Yeah, that's kind of. I mean,
I
that
mean, to
is.
draw more on what you said, though, I think you touched on a really important point, and that's that the church can really be a mitigating influence against
Mhm.
totalitarianism because what the church will do is it will insist that the princes and the kings uh, promote the welfare of the subjects, lest the kings and the princes be excommunicated. And the church will protect the integrity of the hierarchy in insisting that the subjects obey their authorities, lest they be deprived of eternal life. So the church will simultaneously, because it hovers above both domains of subject and ruler, of temporal subject and temporal ruler, um, it can secure a harmonious existence between those two classes. I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, and one of the things that these people point out, these critics of integralists point out, is that it makes the church unaccountable, and that's how if we had integralism, then then we wouldn't then the
Ah,
then the church then the clerics will become tyrants and sexually abuse children or something.
see, that's the exact opposite of what happened, because what what you actually end up now when the church is severed from the state, the church has to police itself. It can't really trust temporal authorities to uh, become part of the church's oversight of itself. Whereas if you have this harmonious relationship between church and state, well, if the church can have enough confidence in the state to step in uh, when clerics are abusing their privileges or sexually abusing minors. Um, so I would argue it's the opposite. It's an integralist state which can avoid uh, the church from just having to self-police itself.
Right. I think that's really key here because the I mean one of the things about integralism is that it presents two powers that
Yes.
are distinct, but they can that are distinct. And while one is above the other in terms of the ends that they serve,
Hmm.
they're both working together. And
Yeah,
the state,
exactly.
and just as the church has its rights against the state also has its rights against the church. Integralism isn't. You can't have clerics under integralism going around saying that the state isn't allowed to celebrate this or that national
Right,
holiday
exactly, exactly.
because that would be clearly be an abuse of power.
Hmm.
But if there is this kind of unity, if there is this kind of partnership, then they can check each other like that.
Well, I
Um,
mean, like if you think about the relationship between the soul and the body too, uh, the body will sometimes have to impose its own sort of obligations on the soul. The body needs to recharge itself through sleep, for example, and the soul will have to yield to the demands of the body. Uh, but the body is still subordinate to the soul because, again, it's this relationship between the imperfect to the perfect. That the body cannot be a body without the soul.
well,
Um,
exactly. I would also say that one of the other features of the body, if you talk about if you talk about the last things, um, yeah, the reason why angelic wills are obstinate is because they do not have a body, and so
right.
when they choose wrongly, they choose wrongly in perpetuity.
Hmm.
Whereas with humans, they can if their wills can the direction of their wills can be interrupted if they're by sense input, basically. So their wills can be changed for the better by sense input. Should like for example, let's say you have a person who has a really bad temper, and he doesn't really have self control over this, and as a result, he goes out and he whenever he gets angry, he destroys things. Well, that kind of wrathful will can be tempered by the body if the body is let's say that that this person he gets put into prison for assaulting someone. That
Right.
kind of that kind of bodily corporal punishment invites the soul to do some reflection, and perhaps the person, God willing, will receive grace and turn over a new leaf.
Yeah.
Maybe not right away, but through discipline, he comes to conform his will to right teaching. And I think that's something that the church and state can work together on if both of them were on the same page.
Yeah. Well said.
All right. I think we have gone over this idea in a kind of broad strokes sort of way. I mean, we could go on for several more hours just talking about this, but I think I agreed to limit myself to this much. So, do you have any final thoughts?
Um, I think just to say that I recommend just keep reading into this issue. I would recommend read again that integralism book that we mentioned. Read the old encyclicals too, if you have a chance. Like read Immortali Dei, read Quanta Cura, read Mirari Vos. You should familiarize yourself with papal teaching on this issue, and I think once you do that, you'll get to understand these principles uh, at I think a much deeper level. But I hope our discussion was helpful for you guys.
All right. Well, my name's William. This is Applied Virtue, and we'll be signing out now. Thank you, Classical Theist.
My pleasure.